Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jennifer Joyce. I'm the Training and Information Specialist with Transcend and Mid-Atlantic ADA Center, and we're very excited to be bringing you this joint venture today with Transcend and Mid-Atlantic ADA Center sponsoring our webinar and our speaker today. Today's webinar is Understanding and Supporting ADHD in the Workplace. Now, I am very excited to introduce our speaker for today, Ms. Megan Brown Enya. She is a ADHD coach and an HR workplace consultant and the owner and coach of ADHD at Work. So Megan, I'm going to pass it over to you. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to hear your expertise in this area.
Thank you so much for having me, and I really appreciate everybody taking the time out of their day to be able to join this conversation. So again, we're going to be talking about understanding and supporting ADHD in the workplace. And again, hi, I'm Megan, just to introduce myself one more time. And this is just actually, can you switch? Okay, thanks. And so this is such an important topic for so many reasons. So we're talking to HR leaders, managers, or those that inspire to be in those particular positions, or those that are actively have ADHD and are trying to navigate this workplace, right? But it's so important to be able to position ourselves to normalize ADHD to reduce stigma. And so what we do know about ADHD, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but then also the impact that it has on our mental health. So we know that 60% of the workforce indicates that the mental health is impacted by their job and specifically their employer, right? Their direct manager. And so there's research out there that says that the manager's impact on the employee's mental health is more important than their spouse, than their kids, than their other family members. And so ensuring that we create a safe space within the work environments and creating that psychological safety is really extremely important. Because when managers are empathetic and trained, then we can increase retention rates. We can reduce the number of reducing the number of people that are losing their jobs, because then there's also a lot of research around when ADHDers are not being supported in the workplace, then they're most likely to either impulsively quit, voluntarily leave in another way, or involuntarily leave their position, right? And so we want to position ourselves as an organization or as HR leaders in order to keep people employed. And as ADHDers, especially as an ADHDer myself, employment is important. Being employed matters, all right? And so we want to be able to make sure that we're creating a space that allows us to thrive in the workplace. You can go ahead to the next one. Thank you. So what is ADHD and what it isn't, right? So there's a lot of stigma around ADHD, but what ADHD really is truly is a neurological difference. And so the way that the ADHD brain works is just different than the way that non-ADHD's brain work. And so we're thinking about and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but I want to be clear that this is a neurodevelopmental condition that impacts the brain, right? And so in a lot of ways, we think about, for some reason, our society likes to think as though the brain is not a part of our body, but it is, and it controls everything that we do, right? And so it's important to really, truly understand how it functions so that we can work with it instead of against it. But I want to be clear that ADHD, and there's a lot of stigma around it, and there's also a lot of incorrect information that is floating in mainstream social media and other environments around it, but we want to make sure that it's not laziness. It's not because of poor parenting. It's not a lack of motivation. It is not something that we're growing out of. And so we talk a lot about, when we talk about ADHD, we usually talk about children, right? And so like children are getting diagnosed with ADHD, but all these children turn into adults at some point. And so we want to make sure that we're clear that this isn't something that's going away. This is something that will be, how it presents may look different, but it's something, your brain is different. And so you want to be able to position yourself to be able to accommodate that. Okay, you can come. And so what ADHD actually is that it's a brain-brain difference. And so it impacts the way that we think and we feel and the way we work. And so in some cases, and some neuropsychologists will talk about ADHD in the way of, we know what to do, but doing it is sometimes the challenge. And so knowing what to do isn't the problem. knowing how to do it can sometimes be a problem, and bridging that connection. And that's why it's so important to have supports in place. The other thing about ADHD is highly contextual. So thinking about how ADHD impacts you at work may be a little bit different about how it impacts you in the home. And when you are, or let's say when you're out with your friends and other different social environments. And so who you are with and the environment that you're in will impact how the ADHD shows up in your life, right? So when I talk about ADHD with my clients and thinking about what are your stronger and weaker executive functions and how they're showing up for you, it is how are the weaker executive functions showing up in this particular environment? Because you may not have the same challenge in different spaces. Also, it is very often misunderstood when there are multiple identifiers on top of ADHD in of itself. So if you're a woman, women tend to have be diagnosed later for a variety of reasons, and so sometimes we're in a position where our kids are getting diagnosed, and then we're realizing that the kids are just like us, and so because they're just like us, we're then connecting the dots around our own childhood experiences and then going through that own process of being diagnosed as later as an adult. It also impacts women differently too because our hormones are differently and they change over time. And thinking again about what ADHD is, it affects our brain. So that means also all of our neurotransmitters and like the serotonin and dopamine and all of the aspects that make our brain function are different. And in some cases, we'll talk about ADHD as like, you may hear people like dopamine seeking, and then because there's a deficiency when it comes to our dopamine production within the ADHD brain, and that will impact our energy levels, will impact our reward system. And so all of that is really important to take in consideration because again, ADHD is a brain-based difference. And so that's important. We can go ahead and go. And so I mentioned briefly thinking about executive function. So ADHD, where it really impacts our brain the most, and where most people really talk about it, is our frontal lobe. So that's where our executive functions are managed in our brain. So when you think about executive functions, they are what are the things that we're doing in order to help us plan, to organize, to regulate our emotions, and to follow through on tasks, right? So it's that doing part. It's all of the things that are involved with getting stuff done. And so there are particular aspects of our executive functions that can be impacted by ADHD. And it varies a little bit from person to person. And so that's why I always suggest either people talk to their psychologist around what are their executive function strengths and weaknesses, or you can also take an assessment on your own. There's one available on my website for free. And that information is available at the end of this presentation. But thinking about our working memory. So what is the information that we're trying to hold in our brain while we're trying to do other things? So if you're thinking about you're checking your email, but then somebody comes into your office and starts talking to you about something, like your brain is somewhere else, right? And so you're trying to hold on to different tasks and remember those different tasks, but while you're doing something else. And so the working memory aspect of ADHD can definitely be impacted for you. And so you don't want to try to hold on to all of the information because you're just not going to be able to. So poor working memory can go hand in hand with ADHD. Also, time management. Time management is another one of those executive functions that really impacts everything that we do. And so it's not just, are you showing up late? But do you actually have a concept of time and space, whether or not it's time in the present or time in the future? And so there is a difference in the way that the ADHD brain views time. And so that can be a really big challenge when we're thinking about future planning and being able to think about the steps that are required, right? So it's like the now or the not now, and the time in between. The longer the time is in between, like now and not now, or like that future planning, things can get lost. And so it's really important to be able to take time and make it more tangible as well. And then we're thinking about impulse control. So that's when we're talking about impulsive decision making, right? And so you're upset, you're experiencing some emotional regulation, and in this particular context, we'll talk about work, and then and then you decide that you want to quit right then and there. But not thinking about how this is going to impact your health insurance, not thinking about how this is going to impact your ability to pay your mortgage. You're upset and then you're making an impulsive decision. And so that ability to be able to control your impulses can also be affected by ADHD at times. Flexibility. Now, flexibility can be one of those executive functions that can be, I mean, all of them really with any ADHD brain, it can be a strength or a weakness. And especially thinking about how much time you're hyper focused on that, because within ADHD, there's three different types. There's inattentive, there's hyperactive, and then there's combined. And depending on what type of ADHD that you have and what your executive functions and weaknesses are, maybe flexibility is a strength. And so in that case, we're adapting to change really quickly. And so that's why sometimes you see a lot of ADHDers in those environments that change rapidly, startups, or the more high intensity emergency related fields as well. It's because what it doesn't, like, if I speak for myself, like, it doesn't bother me if something changes. But ADHD, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but ADHD doesn't come by itself, and so it just typically, and so you have to think about, how your brain is working. Like, is flexibility, does it bother you if there's an immediate change with the direction or what you're doing that day? So, for example, I had to change location today from one presenting today, and now I'm in a completely new environment, and that was within the last 15 minutes, right? And so my body doesn't have a negative response to that change because flexibility is a stronger executive function for me. And then some additional executive functions include task initiation, emotional regulation, and organization. And now, a lot of individuals will argue, and I would probably 100% agree, is that our ability to regulate our emotions is one of the top challenges with the ADHD brain. It is not a part of the DSM-5 in terms of the criteria when you're in the diagnostic process, but it is a huge part of it, and everybody in this field knows that it's a huge part of it. And that's when thinking about how are we managing stress, urgency, rejection. So anything that is impacting us and impacting our emotions is then therefore going to be able to impact our next steps. And so what thoughts are we having, what emotions are being driven, and then how are our emotions being impacted by what it is that we're doing next. And when you start to combine and think about some of these executive functions when they are together. So for example, let's say you're really upset, you're in a meeting, you leave a meeting, and it's really triggering for a lot of different reasons, right? But you know that you have an entire day of work that you still need to get done, but now you're emotionally dysregulated. So now that time that you need to take in order to get yourself together is not necessarily taken in consideration when you're thinking about how you're managing your time for that day. Or when you're doing some project planning, where you're including the time that you need in order to regulate your emotions between tasks, between interactions that you're having with people that you're working on and with the projects. And so all of that is important. So that's why it's really important for not just the ADHD to understand how your brain works and what your executive function and strengths and weaknesses are, how they interact with each other, but then also as an organization. You have employees, and then there's some new research, especially within the United States. There's some of the more recent researches around the actual percentages of people within the workplace around neurodiversity, right? And so what we're learning is that a large chunk, almost 70% of the workplace, is actually neurodiverse. And so that isn't necessarily ADHD specific, but we're talking about a large spectrum of neurodiversity. And you can actually click over to the next page.
And Megan, as you move through your presentation, please remember to describe the images and announce slide numbers, please.
Okay, I don't see the slide numbers, but I think because my window is...
We are currently on slide 14.
Okay, I'm on slide 14, sorry. I'm on slide 14, and this particular slide we're going to be talking about ADHD and other neurodivergent presence. And there is a picture of a brain that is colorful, a picture of a woman looking at a computer, and then another woman staring at a computer with her arms raised. And so what is important about understanding the the diversity within your workforce, or within yourself, right? Is that ADHD can sometimes come with other challenges that you may be experiencing, right? And so sometimes there's ADHD, there's autism, because there's different types of neurodivergence. So again, when I'm talking about that workplace is about 70% neurodiverse, we're talking about ADHD, autism, dyslexia, anxiety, dyscalculia. And so there's a variety of forms of neurodivergence within the workplace. And and that's why it's really important to know and take some time to know who is working for you, and also creating spaces that are inclusive. And ADHD can co-concur with other conditions too, especially with anxiety or depression. And so and there's a variety of reasons for that, which I'm not going to get into within this particular conversation. But sometimes the ADHD can come. Other people within ADHD can also experience some anxiety and depression in the same context. And so it's important to be able to know that. And so in thinking about, ADHD from an employee perspective, you may be experiencing and struggling with being able to prioritize tasks, being able to follow through. Because again, we talked about the ability to be able to, what to do, but doing it can sometimes be a challenge because of some of the combination of executive functioning weaknesses that you may be experiencing. And because of that, and if you're not getting the support that you need, and especially within the workplace, again, when thinking about how impactful it is on your mental health, it can lead to burnout, it can lead to low confidence, and it can lead to poor evaluations. And the rejection sensitivity that we experience as ADHDers is more than the neurotypical brain would. And so when you're giving me negative feedback, I feel that a little bit more deeply than you may think. And because of that, it may position me, and especially if there's other things going on, it may position me to lead with the negative thoughts, which is going to lead to more emotional dysregulation, which is going to lead to more burnout and dissatisfaction on both ends. And so it's important to understand that if you're working with an employee that may be extremely sensitive to rejection, it's like, how are you giving them that feedback? And so that's why it's important. And also, from the employee perspective, like you may be afraid to even say anything, right? And so you don't have to disclose at work. It's an option, but you don't have to disclose, and you don't have to access services if you don't want them, right? And so thinking about because in some cases you may be afraid to communicate that to your manager, because you don't want them to believe that you're not a good employee, and you are. You just need some additional support, and you just need the way that people are managing you to be tweaked a little bit differently. And the other thing to take into consideration is, like, when we talked about women being late diagnosed, so like women are getting diagnosed in their 30s, their 40s, their 50s, their 60s, and even older, right? And so we're in the workforce and we're learning ourselves for the first time. And because we're in the process of trying to figure out and unlearn all of the things that we grew up with, we're now in a position where we're relearning and trying to be more effective so that we're not experiencing the negative impacts that we've been experiencing thus far. And now from the employer perspective, you may see an employee that is missing deadlines, that is having trouble task switching, that is giving you inconsistent communication, and may misunderstand what it is that you're communicating to them. And so now you're making some assumptions around what's going on. Oh, this employee is lazy. Oh, they just don't understand what's going on. They just need to be trained again. And you're positioning yourself to put in interventions that aren't working for the ADHD brain. And so retraining may not be the challenge. The challenge actually may be to train the manager to communicate differently, so that we're not leading to some of the challenges that they may be experiencing when you're triggering some weaker executive functions, right? And so there's a difference between saying hey, dear manager, I need help with prioritizing tasks, and that manager believing that I shouldn't have to tell you how to prioritize a task. You should be able to do that yourself. But in the reality is having that check-in, having that additional support, because there's a neurological difference in being able to organize the thoughts within our heads, or not having the right necessary tools and to be able to prioritize and organize our work. It actually is really difficult. And so it's not an excuse, and it's not I'm being lazy, or the expectation is off, right? And so we need to be able to try to increase the communication that is happening between the employee and the employer, so that we can get on the same page and reduce the assumptions that are being made, and so that we can be able to be successful in the workplace from both perspectives, right? Like we want businesses to be successful, and we want their employees to be successful, right? And so it's increasing the communication between both parties in order to make that work. And so because without doing that, it can be an organizational risk, and it's expensive to keep hiring people, right? And like we have the data on this. It is expensive to lose people. We want to keep those numbers up. We want to keep people employed as long as possible, and we want to be able to ensure that we're supporting them and creating these safe environments so that people stay. We have this outcomes and this goals that organizations need to meet, right? And so it's how are we taking care of our people? And part of that taking care of the people is understanding who you have that's working for you. With that all being said, because I feel like I've talked a lot about all of the challenges that we experience as ADHDers, and I don't want to leave the audience with feeling as though ADHD is like the worst thing that you could possibly have in the world, because that's not true. And so we can go to the next slide, because I want to talk a little bit about ADHD strengths. And so when we think about our ADHD strengths, we want to make sure that we are supporting people so that we unlock the potential and not the weaknesses. We have a variety of ADHD strengths as well. And so again, when we talk about neurological differences and executive functioning strengths, I just want to make this one little point clear, is that everybody has a brain, everybody has a frontal lobe, and everybody has stronger and weaker executive functions. Just what the weaker executive functions look like within the ADHD brain may just look different than those that do not have ADHD brain. And unfortunately, our entire society is designed for one particular type of person and one particular type of way of functioning, even though we know that a good 70% of the workforce doesn't work that way, right? And so we want to be able to position ourselves as leaders, as HR professionals, as managers, as employers or entrepreneurs, and just individuals as well, is that position ourselves for the ADHDer to operate in their strengths, right? And so we're great at big picture thinking. And so we can, because our brain is processing information so quickly, and ADHD is, the H is hyperactive, and so it's not that it's not that we're not. So there's some challenges with focusing, but the real challenge is that we have so much information going on at the same time. We're processing things so quickly and that we can kind of sometimes see things that other people can't see, right? And so thinking about, I have a very neurotypical husband, right? And so thinking about, let me just give an example. Like if we're walking or driving, like so maybe we're walking in the park. As the ADHD brain, I see everything. Like I see the birds, I see the trees, I see everything leaving. I can see everything that's happening at once. But my very neurotypical husband can only see like what's in front of him. And so when I say like, oh my God, did you see that red bird that's flying over there? He is looking at me like I'm crazy, because he doesn't even know what I'm talking about, because he's very focused on what's happening in front of him. But then taking that same scenario, you're sitting in a meeting and we're talking about a project, the ADHDer kind of sees all of the different pieces all happening at the same time. But we may just be talking about one thing, but because our brain is moving so quickly, we want to now impulsively talk about all the other things. But the point is that we can see a lot of information and we have that big picture thinking. And also we're super creative. In thinking about, we tend to be in entrepreneurship. Why? Because we're creative. We're able to find solutions to problems that people are experiencing, and then we start businesses, right? And so some of the top tech leaders in the world all have ADHD. ADHD or autism or somewhere in the neurodiverse spectrum, right? And so the world needs the ADHD brain just as much as we need the neurotypical brain, right? Because there wouldn't be the innovative and creativity and thinking without having people that are creative and innovative, right? We can also tend to be really helpful in crisis management, and really passionate. And so the ADHD brain, what I didn't talk about earlier, is that we're also very interest-based. We're interest-based and novelty, right? And so when we are interested in something, we are super hyper-focused on it. But when we're not interested in something, trying to convince ourselves to start a task can be really difficult as well. You can actually go to the next one. This changed a little bit. I don't see the what number slide we're on right now. Let me just make this bigger. Yeah, 18. Okay, I'm sorry. I can't see the slide numbers on my end. But this is slide 18. And so this is talking a little bit more about some of the strengths that we have. And so remembering that we talked about big picture thinking and creativity, but we're able to hyper focus when we're really engaged because the ADHD brain is very interest focused. So if you have an ADHD on our team and it's something that they're really passionate about, when I tell you they're going to give you 150%, they're going to get 150%, right? And so we can be very high energy and enthusiastic. We're also curious and adaptable. And so thinking about learning new things and curiosity, and we also approach questions. We tend to, because our brain again is always thinking, and we tend to be really curious in a lot of ways. And so we'll ask questions so that we can better understand things. Like it's really important for us to understand sometimes like the why behind things and being able to move forward. And so sometimes like when we're given a task and we don't understand it, and it doesn't make sense to us, it's going to be hard for us to stop until we get the answers to those questions. And so you may have an employee that is asking a lot of questions, and it's not, but it can be viewed from the employee or the manager sometimes as though they're questioning the decision. They're not trusting the manager, or they're being viewed as a difficult person because they're asking all of these follow-up questions. And the reality is it's not true. It's like it's about understanding so that like being able to move forward and operating from a space of curiosity and not judgment. And so it's that difference in understanding of like the reason why people are asking questions that can make a really big difference in how people are treated within the workplace. You can go to the next one, slide 19. So slide 19, we have some additional strengths. Why we have multiple slides? Because ADHDers have a lot of strengths. And so we also tend to be resilient, have empathy. There's a social justice lean. We tend to be really social justice driven. So like we're in environments that are, if we're going to be doing something that's going to be negatively impacting people, it's going to really bother us to a whole other level. And so it's important that, like, if you're working with somebody, you're asking them to do something that just doesn't feel right, you may get some pushback on that, right? And so because we have sensitivity to social justice in that way. Risk tolerance and bold thinking, we are going to, and that's like, a part of our being ability to be creative, right? And so we're going to be thinking outside of the box in a lot of ways, and being able to access that level of creativity and innovation, and being able to position somebody to ask the difficult questions is going to be extremely helpful for organizations, because organizations all have to have some level of innovation, or else they're not going to succeed, right? Like you need to be position yourself to position yourself in the market so that you actually get a customer base, right? So like you need to be innovative. And so tapping into the creativity and understanding of the ADHD brain is actually really going to help your business. And the question for business leaders and HR managers and other managers, like, how are you accessing these strengths, right? Like how are you utilizing them in order to be able to grow your organization and to support your organizational culture, and to help your organization itself thrive? tapping into strengths is good for everybody, right? Like it's good for the individual. It makes them feel good. It feels them make useful. It makes them feel happy to be in the workplace. And it also is helpful for the organization as well. We can go to slide 20. And so, when we're thinking about, we'll just switch gears just a little bit and thinking about, so what do you do? So you have an employee that works for your organization, and they are either expressing an interest in accommodations, or they're not expressing the addition of accommodations, but you notice that they could probably use some, right? And so this is this concept that I want you to think about when it comes to accommodations versus just inclusive design. And a lot of the research out there is like when the accommodations that ADHDers are looking for, and other employees that have other disabilities are also asking for, really help everyone. And so are you being reactionary and providing that individualized support that an employee wants their need is disclosed, or are you being proactive in creating an inclusive design space that allows a variety of individuals to be able to work in that space and be and to feel supported, right? And so are we creating an environment that reduces barriers? And so that could look anything like and so thinking about, just putting my design hat on for a second, and thinking about having spaces that were quiet rooms, right? So like if you have like open workspaces, but you have an option for individual private offices, like a solid desk versus a desk that goes up and down, chairs that are ergonomic, doorways that are wide enough in order to be able to allow other like wheelchairs or other mobile devices, right? And so it's thinking about how you, and like, or lighting, right? Like, do you have the option to be able to turn down lights? Like sometimes people are really sensitive to the fluorescent lightings. I don't know who likes fluorescent lightings, but I don't know why that was a design choice in general. But thinking about being able to have the option to change that, right? And so it's, are you thinking, and it's not even just the physical space either, because that's kind of an easy scapegoat when thinking about inclusive design. It's also about those policies, right? So like I worked in an environment where it was this, I had my own office, which was great as an adult with ADHD, and I had natural lighting, which was also great. However, the policy around working with staff and management was that they can come and bother you. Sorry, I shouldn't say bother you. They can come speak to you. They can come speak to you whenever they would like, right? And so it was a very open door policy type of organizational culture. However, as somebody with ADHD, knowing that I'm going to be constantly interrupted was horrible. It was a horrible experience for me. And so knowing that I could have office hours where I know when people are going to be coming to visit me was very helpful versus just not knowing, and then people were just coming in whenever they want. So right, so now I'm sitting in my office, I know that I have 10 things to do, but now people are coming in and interrupting me, and knowing that I have a task initiation challenge, or depending on what it is that they're talking to me about, if it's going to cause some level of dysregulation in some way or the other, then it's going to be harder for me to start that task. And so now I'm leaving my work day, like my office workday, or I'm extending my time in my office until they leave, right? So then I can actually get work done. And so thinking about those policies, that they sound nice, because like it's trying to be able to encourage people to be able to just speak to management when they need something, but at the same time it could be negatively impacting your employees that have ADHD, because it's causing their inability to actually get work done, right? And that's the difference between thinking about having an inclusive design versus just providing an accommodation. Like I could have asked an accommodation, or you can just say, we're going to have office hours, and these are the office hours where you can talk to your manager, right? And so we can go to slide 21. There's also other opportunities to build inclusion across the employee life cycle. And these are the employee life cycle is thinking about all the different stages in which you're working with an employee. So that includes the recruiting, the hiring, once they start onboarding, the day-to-day work, performance reviews, leadership development, and nutrition, right? And so there are some examples I provided in the chart around how you can create inclusion across the employee life cycle. So thinking about having structured interviews, giving somebody, if they disclose that they need, or actually they don't even have to disclose. So if you're thinking about your hiring process, it's, is there a set of interview questions that you're going to be able to have? You can just provide those questions as a practice to everyone that applies that you're interviewing, right? Like you don't, somebody doesn't have to, or they shouldn't have to ask you for these things that you can just provide them. And like just providing them creates an inclusive process. Creating an application that doesn't ask for the same information 10 times is inclusive practice, right? And so making that process easier for people will support not just the ADHDer, but then also people in the that are also neurodiverse that are experiencing other brain differences, but then also neurotypical brains as well, right? Trying to reduce some of the redundancy, like providing these accommodations will support everyone, right? And thinking about onboarding. How many times have people onboarded and it's not really an onboarding? And so doing some planning beforehand, creating some clear schedules, some written instructions. Like these are inclusive practices that really do support everyone. Day-to-day work, visual supports, body doubling, having access to body doubling. And that is a really good tool for a lot of ADHDers. And for those that may be wondering what body doubling is, I like to describe it as stealing the energy from other people that are doing work. And so it's essentially you're working in a space with other people, whether not virtually or in person. And because somebody else is working, you now feel inspired as an ADHDer to get stuff done too. Um, and that's how I describe it. Like you're kind of borrowing the energy from the other productive people in order to help you be more productive, right? But like being able to set up systems so they have access to body doubling within the workplace is an inclusive practice. We can. So I hope that information was really helpful for everyone. But I wanted to talk a little bit also about me and my practice. So my practice is, we talk about my practice is called ADHD at Work, and so we really truly try to provide not just the individuals with ADHD, but also the employers more information about how to support the ADHDer, right? And so, and I also expand the definition of work. So it's ADHD at work, as in like your employer, but it's also ADHD at work. Like, how is it showing up for you? Right. And so, it's partially psychoeducational content. And so, because a lot of people are coming and not really understanding how their brain works. And so we're combining some psychoeducational work and along with coaching and some consulting, right? And so it's that combination. And so I provide, so I provide one-on-one coaching, and also I have a group coaching program for women with ADHD. And so, and then it can be employee sponsored or individuals pay for it as well. And so what happens is, like within the accommodation process, when people you can ask as an accommodation to ask for an ADHD coach, right? And so with my employee sponsored program, and not just because I feel really strongly about this. I do not believe that the ADHD should be walking into the work environment and change everything about themselves in order to fit in, right? Like that's dangerous. That's going to lead to burnout. That's going to lead to stress. It's not going to be helpful for anybody. And so, but what I do when I work with my employees, and if an employee is sponsored, we talk about the length of time that we're going to be accessing coaching. But then we also talk about how to support the manager that is working with the employee. So I provide not just coaching to the individual employee, but then also to the individuals that are going to be working with the employee at the organization. And so it's really important for me to be able to have those conversations with those that are working with them more directly, so that they can shift the way that they're doing things in order to be more supportive. So like some of the things that I talked about in this particular presentation. And with the individual one-on-one coaching program, we talk a little bit. We can go to the slide 20. I'm sorry that I can't see the numbers, but we can go to the next slide, 22. We can go to slide 22. So when my approach to working with one-on-one and also with just employee sponsored is really trying to increase your awareness around how your brain works. And that's like, so all of my clients have the option to do the executive functioning assessment. And we also have some other assessments that we do as well that's related to your career, like you're just better understanding your strengths, but then also your value systems. And so it's recognizing that, the ADHD brain is not just is interest driven, but then it's novelty. But we really should understand what your value systems are and what you're leading with, and they could support your growth, but they can also hinder your growth as well. And so it's really just increasing that awareness. So that's where some of the psychoeducational work comes in and comes into play. And then we're going to be dealing with the emotional dysregulation part, right? So we're going to be dealing with any shame that you may be experiencing and any self-judgment. So we're going to be working on practicing and learning how to practice non-judgment with ourselves, right? And so, and it's going through that acceptance process. And it's going to differ because remember, ADHD is situational, right? And so it's depending on how it's impacting you in different environments. And so in one area, you may have understanding like, okay, yes, I just have poor working memory and I just need to put in some accommodations in place in one particular context, but in another context, you may not even be thinking about it. And then that's where we're like, okay, we just need to accept that we have ADHD. Working memory is a challenge no matter what environment that we're in, right? And then I talk a little bit, and then we talk about accommodations and strategies. So we talk about accommodations in a couple of different ways. So accommodations and like what accommodations can you access under ADA, so the American Disabilities Act, from your employer. Is your employer required to even provide you these accommodations, right? So we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about, are you working from home? Are you working in a hybrid situation? Are you working from home and in the office? Are you just working from the office? Like, what does your work environment look like so that we can, one, identify what accommodations are going to make sense for that particular scenario that you're living in, and we also talk about what accommodations and strategies you can put in place that are just completely independent of what your employer can provide you, that you can just do on your own, right? So we'll talk about those differences. And then action. So it doesn't make any sense to learn how to do all these things if you don't actually put them in place, right? And again, like with ADHD, it's like I know what to, and once you learn what to do, and it's like, how do you actually put that stuff into practice? And so we'll talk a little bit about that too. So we're going to build a bridge between the knowing and the doing together. And so we're going to learn how to effectively create habits and routines, and I'm going to work for the ADHD brain. If you have goals, like I have a whole structure and I have a whole workshop around how to accomplish your goals with ADHD, and I use a particular framework in order to be able to talk about that, right? And so we're going to keep ADHD in mind whenever it is that we're trying to do anything. And now you can go to the next slide. And so this is slide 24. So slide 24, like why this approach works. This approach works because it blends coaching, HR expertise, and ADA insights. And so we didn't talk about is a little bit about my background, right? And so my background is in social work. And so I'm a trained social worker and an educator, and I've been in operations business for, I don't know, 15, 20 years at this point. And so I have that people knowledge in both ways. So, and how, and the impact that the social environments have on individuals too. So I start with that foundation, and then having a clear understanding of HR practice and HR law, and also information about ADA. And so additional certification in the American Disabilities Act as well. And I take a strengths-based approach. So we're always going to be talking about our strengths, and then we're going to talk about how to make sure that we're actually utilizing those strengths. And because I have a background in social work, I'm going to be trauma informed. And so I'm going to be able to talk to you specifically about, here's the questions that we're going to be talking about, and here's how we're going to work together as a coach. But if you are accessing therapy, here are also some really good questions that you can ask your therapist. And so being able to distinguish the two very clearly, because I walk that line very carefully. And so, my goal is to be empowering, not punitive, and I want to create a really safe space. And a lot of my experience is also just is rooted in real life experience. And so I will use some of my story to help support you if that's what you need. If you don't need that, I don't need to tell you, but I'm a very open book, right? And so, because again, everybody's life is different, right? But like, if you need an understanding of like how it presents into real life, then I can be able to provide you that experience as well. And I just also have just years of experience of just working with clients as well. So we can go to slide 25, I believe. So I wanted to offer you a couple of things. So I also get a lot of questions around, is my company required to provide me accommodations legally? So you know, under ADA, the federal law with American Disabilities Act, the federal law, it requires it's for 15 and more employees. However, states have their own individual laws as well. And so in this free gift, what I'm providing you is a list of all of the 50 states and some territories that chart their employee thresholds for the disability accommodations, right? So you may be in a state and working for an employer that has one or two employees. And so, you know, the question is, are they required to provide you accommodations? And the answer to that question may be yes, or it may be no, depending on the state that you're in. And so this particular chart just gives you that information. And so I'm hoping that that is helpful for you. And then there's a link to my website, and these are QR code images. And there's a link to my website, and there's a link to my group coaching program. And the group coaching program, I didn't talk a lot about it, but the group coaching program is specifically for women with ADHD, where I provide group coaching weekly. We have lessons weekly or a couple times a month. I have special guests as well, and all that information is recorded. And I also do workshops. So like within my group coaching program, and sometimes I open them to the public. So I'm going to be doing another webinar next month around readiness for change. And so that workshop and all the recordings are available for free for Thrive members, and then additional costs for the non-Thrive members. But I do workshops, and we are creating community. There's an app, and so people can talk to each other individually, like if you want a body double with somebody. So it's about creating a community in addition to being able to have access to resources, whether or not in the group. And there's also self-coaching opportunities too. And so there's workbooks that you can do to learn more about your executive functions and to be able to create your own strategies, because you know your life better than anybody else. And also there's some goals workbooks. So I'm always creating things. And so when I have the bandwidth, those will be uploaded to the Thrive platform and accessible for the members as well. And I want to say that is it. We can pause at the previous slide on slide 25.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know what happened there. That was really weird. I was thanking you, Megan, for all the great information that you provided, and saying that there are people in the chat box who are saying they really appreciate this information. And there were some who had been diagnosed with ADHD later in life. There were two I noticed. One was 45 and another was 56, and they were appreciating this information and saying how nice it was to hear about the strengths of people who have ADHD. So thank you for that as well. But we also have some questions that we wanted to talk about back and forth a little bit as we continue this presentation. And also for those of you who have had questions, I see someone saying 66 and they were diagnosed at 65. If you have questions, please feel free to put them into the chat box and we'll try and get to them as we go along with this discussion. But one of the things that was coming up in the chat box, and you and I talked about this too, Megan, was disclosure in itself. And when someone should disclose, what that process looks like, how to deal with that, what feelings come along with that process. And I know it's different for everybody, obviously, in different circumstances, but maybe you could talk a little bit about what you've experienced or what you've seen other people with ADHD experience when it comes to disclosure.
Yeah, so it is going to be a really wide range, right? And so whenever somebody asks me, like, should I disclose at work? I'm like, well, it's really going to depend. And it's going to depend on your own comfort level. It's going to depend on the organization that you're working for. And we know that not every work culture is safe, right? And so it may not be the best setup for you to be able to disclose. And that's why it's such a personal decision. Now, it's always hard to answer this question, right? Because I've seen the good and I've seen the bad. Like I've seen people need to sue their organization because they're just not following the law. And then there's other organizations that give you everything. Like they give you coaching, they give you a treadmill, they give you all of the things to help support you because that's their organizational culture, right? Like their culture is around supporting the people that work for you, right? And so it's, thinking about, you want to just be able to have that honest conversation with yourself about what it is that you're going to be walking into, before you disclose that work. But also recognizing that you can ask for things even without disclosing, and to shift certain environments, to shift the environment a little bit, right? And so, I mean, there are benefits for disclosing because, you're actually able to get supports and you have that, the legal support. But I've seen it again, like I've seen it go really well. And I'm sure that there's people that are listening to this webinar right now that have had really great experiences and probably also really poor experiences, as well.
Yeah, I'm also seeing in the box, someone just asked, should they disclose or should they not disclose in their workforce? And you said in the very beginning, it depends. And I think it is such an individual choice. And it's really going to be coming down to how the impact of your ADHD affects you at work, right? If you're able to do your job and it's not being impacted by ADHD, or you have a job where you're thriving because it matches really well with,
Right.
your personality and what's going on, you may not need to disclose or want to disclose, right? But if you are seeing that there are things going on in the job site that are making it difficult for you to be able to get your job done,
Mhm.
in the way that it's structured at that time, maybe that is the time when you have to get disclosed. Or maybe you even just start with talking about, I could do my job better if we did it this way, and
Right.
not disclose. And then if you find out that that's not working, maybe then you do have to disclose. I think, like you said, it's
Yeah.
such an individual choice and
It is
depends
an
on the
individual choice.
circumstances, right?
It is an individual choice, and also thinking about, you want to plan ahead a little bit too, because if you're starting to feel as though like the ADHD is impacting your work, I would recommend getting some supports, whether or not that's within your organization or without your organization, because the performance improvement plan process and the disciplinary process and the ADA process can happen at the same time, and I would argue that it's better to get people the support that they need before you start putting people on a PIP. Um, but depending on what organization you work with, they may do
Yeah.
it at the same time, right?
That goes in line with another question I saw that came up earlier, which was someone asking, how would you address a supervisor that's old school, that was the term they use, and is pushing back on you talking about ADHD and needing some accommodations or assistance in other kinds of ways?
Right. So there's the manager pushback, but then there's the HR policies, right? And then that's when you need to get support from your HR department, because that's like, we're not in a position to trying to convince your manager whether or not you have a disability that is supported under the ADA, right? Like it's not their decision to decide whether or not you have ADHD, and it's not their decision to decide whether or not you deserve supports. Um, and so that's when you may need to access some
Bump it
additional,
up a level.
yeah, bump it up a level or two or to the side. So it's um, it's definitely, they're not the gatekeeper. The manager is not the gatekeeper about whether or not you have access to accommodations. That's
Right.
not how
Yeah.
it works.
Absolutely. And so that we've also had a lot of questions asking about specific kinds of accommodations. What are things that work, things that don't work? And again, this is going to be something that's very much individualized to the person and this job and what's going on at the workplace. But I did think, and you thought also it might be good to talk about some accommodations that are working, some innovative approaches to accommodations. So maybe some flexible deadlines and schedules. Maybe you can start by talking a little bit more about that.
Right, and so these are some common accommodations that you will see. And I also would recommend people visit the JAN network as well, so the Job Accommodation Network, and they have a really nice organized website where you can just filter by ADHD, and it will give you a number of really common accommodations that you can use within the workplace for ADHD. But thinking about flexible deadlines and schedules, and so, I mean, and there's some room there. So you need some structure, right? And so you need to be able to be clear about what the structure is, and having some flexibility around deadlines when things can't go the way that they need to go, right? And I mean, it's all really industry specific and job specific too. But it's also helpful to have those written instructions and visual aids. It's like I know that like I have to watch TV with closed caption on. Like I don't have a challenge with my hearing, but um, something about the closed caption just makes the voices sound clearer. For me, right? And so, but it's being able to ask for those things, like if you work in a virtual environment, like does the programming have closed captioning? So that can make that availability, especially if you're in a virtual setting and you can be just if you're can be distracted really easily, or transcription services, right? And so it's being able to know that if you do miss something and if your brain wanders, you know that you have written documentation of what was just said, so you can just kind of scroll up a little bit and be able to stay on track with the conversation. And so but then, if you're working for organizations that for whatever reason, if there's security challenges or there's just some misconception around AI in general and closed caption services, then that's a challenge that, an organization can work around for most of the time. But it's understanding that need. So like knowing that if you're working in a virtual environment, but like having a transcription is going to be really helpful, especially just going back afterwards too, because there may be parts of the conversation that your mind just started to think about laundry, like, and then you just missed a chunk of the conversation. Being able to have access to that documentation is really helpful. Also, if you're in the office, like having a quiet workspace or noise canceling headphones, something to reduce distractions. And it could be anything, like it's like you do have an office or a cubicle within the space, but it's next to the elevator, so there's a lot of foot traffic. Being asked to be able to be moved to a different part of the office is going to be really helpful, so that you're not constantly like looking out looking out the door, or just feeling like the angst or the anticipation of like being disrupted by somebody walking by, because that's going to impact your ability to get stuff done. The check-ins and prioritization meetings is key. And so, most managers should be having check-ins with their employees, right? But it may be inconsistent. And so you want to make sure that that's really clear. Like, I need to have a weekly check-in. This is the process that we're going to be using to communicate with each other. And I need help, help prioritizing. This is, and you don't necessarily need to say, I need help prioritizing. Like, this is the way that I was thinking about prioritizing my tasks this week. Does that align with the way that you were thinking about them? And if not, let's talk about that. And so like, that's the way that you can have that conversation directly with your manager. Or,
Someone just put, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say in the other way around, like you don't necessarily have to wait for the employer to ask that. Like, here, this is the way that I was thinking about prioritizing, or how are you thinking about prioritizing your task this week? Let's talk about it. Like, without judgment, like we're not getting egos involved. Like, this is just creating that safe space.
I was going to say, someone just put in the chat box a really cool thing where they are really great at starting a project, but have difficulty like getting it to the end zone, I guess I'll say, as to use football terms. I don't know where that came from. That and would have a really hard time keeping the project going and getting it ended. And when she talked to, I guess, her supervisor about that, they had someone else that had a hard time starting a project. So they've been teaming them up on projects so that they are this perfect team of, someone gets it started and then someone takes it to the end, which I thought
Yeah.
was a really cool idea and interesting accommodation as well.
Yeah, and that's inclusive practice, right? Like, that's thinking about who's on your team and who can work well with each other, who has opposite strengths, that if you put it together, there's balance there, right? And that's why it's so important, like as a leader, as a manager, is know who's working for you, so that you can maximize those opportunities for strengths.
Right. They said the last 10% of the project is the most difficult. You are so done and over the project, not interested in it any longer.
Yep,
Um,
it's that interspace. So it's like, to get through that last 10%, we got to think about the project differently, right? Like,
yeah.
there's some thought work that needs to be done there, because the last 10% is always hard. And it also may be the 10% of the work that is taxing your weaker executive functions. So those are going to be the parts that you avoid.
Yeah. And you talked earlier about what was the terminology used? I wrote it down. Body doubling. And someone in the chat asked, because you had mentioned doing that even if you're working virtually. And I think they were wondering, how do you do that if you're working virtually? Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so working virtually, it's like getting on a Zoom or getting on a Google Meet, some video cast where you just kind of put everybody in the corner. And so everybody that is joining is now body doubling. So there are different platforms that host body doubling. So like I host body doubling opportunities within my group coaching program, but there's a number of places now that are offering body doubling, some for free, some that are a cost. I can't remember the name of the ones that are off the top of my head, but there's some major companies now that are just like their whole focus is body doubling.
Interesting. Cool.
But there's some international ones too. Like I'm in a random WhatsApp group in Germany, and every conversation is in German. But like I don't need to talk to anybody then. I just say, is the body doubling opening or not? And so if it is, I can just join it, right? And so there's random networks of people are literally around the world that are doing body double at any given time.
See, one of those examples was something I've never even heard of before, and now I know that it's extremely available and a technique that can be used. So, slide 28, we talked about, we're having a discussion about some good accommodations. What are some of the good accommodations that you've utilized? I know we just talked a little bit about some of them, but in different settings, this leads really well after talking about body doubling in a virtual kind of such situation as well. Um,
Right, and this 528 is really getting to the point that if you it really depends on your work environment, right? So like if you're in person, there's going to be a set of accommodations that are going to be really helpful that are going to be helpful for the challenges that you're experiencing in the office or in the workplace, right? But if you are remote, there's a whole other set of challenges that you could potentially be experiencing. And I did have a whole other presentation around like working from home or like working remote versus working in the office and what you need to take into consideration. But the main point is that working remote doesn't mean working from home. Like working remote can mean working from anywhere else but the office, right? And so, but it's thinking about what challenges you may be experiencing in that particular environment where you now need to put in some accommodations in place. And that's again, but and I say accommodations to be both strategies that you can implement yourself and accommodations that the company can provide you. And then some places people are working both, like Tuesday and Thursday you're in the office, or Thursday and Friday you're in the office, but Monday through Wednesday you're at home. And so it's recognizing that the strategies that you put in one place aren't going to work. They may not necessarily work in the other place as well. And so it's keeping that in mind.
Yeah, definitely. That's reminding me, someone earlier asked about time blindness and saying that, I keep saying she, it could have been a he, I don't remember the person now. They were saying that even talking to their supervisor about having alarms and, other kinds of things to help them isn't going to help them to come to work on time because they are completely blind to it. Do you have any thoughts on that or experience with that or?
Yeah, so time blindness is a very real experience for ADHD, and it's again, I talked about this a little bit earlier, but it's like there's a challenge with the concept of time and understanding what time is, right? And then also if you combine that with some distractions, and all of a sudden an hour went by and you don't know what happened, right? And so it's training yourself. It's almost like, so I usually describe it to people as like you need to study yourself for a little bit. Let's run a couple of experiments. Like how long does it actually take you to shower in the morning? Let's keep a timer in the bathroom. And how can we gamify this also? And so, how can we make this experience fun? And so, because you know that you have to be out of the door after a certain time, but you have a list of things that you need to do beforehand. One is, do you actually know that you need to do before you need to get out the door? That's a whole other thing. But once you do, let's gamify it. So, like, how can we make this experience fun? Let's beat the clock. Let's study ourselves to see how long this actually takes, so that we can no longer trying to guess how long things take, but now you have data to prove it. Like when I take a shower, maybe like 10 minutes, but if I have to wash my hair, I'm going to tax on another 10 minutes, right? And so it's recognizing that we need the data in order to support what's actually happening with time, and then it's not intuitive in the same way it is for other people.
Yeah. So let's move on to slide 29. How do needs change by the work setup? And we talked a little bit about this already. We're like going ahead of ourselves because we're just having this great conversation. Um, but the fact that if you're working in person, that's going to mean something different than if you're working entirely remotely versus if you're working in a
Yes.
hybrid situation, and how that's going to change for somebody with ADHD because of the setting, and that it's not going to be the same circumstances or environment or people that you're interacting with, or all of those kinds of things.
Right, and then remote can look really differently too, right? So like right now I'm in a coffee shop, right? And so that's very different where I'm not surrounded by a bunch of chaos that's currently happening in my house with a toddler. But if I'm working at home, my office is downstairs on the first floor next to the kitchen and the toddler and all of the toys. And so there's the visual distraction. And so how am I creating my, how am I designing my at-home workspace in order to best support my brain? But then recognizing too that I'm probably going to be more focused outside of the home than I am going to be inside of the home, especially during certain times of day when the toddler is awake. Right? And so it's recognizing the challenges that we may be experiencing in each one of these environments. And I also tell people too, like not every weaker executive function is a problem. Like it's a problem when it's a problem, right? But it's not always an issue. And one of the silly examples that I use around that is like, this is whole ideology, especially in neurotypical spaces, that you're supposed to wake up in the morning and you're supposed to make your bed, right? Why? It's like if you're not a good person if you don't wake up and you can't start your day right. And for some people, that's true. But then for other people, it's not. And so thinking about how to structure your life and your day that's going to work good for you and not necessarily for what everybody says that you're supposed to do just because
Yeah.
you're supposed to do it.
Yeah. And I think we talk about that related to disability and work all the time, is what's really important or necessary, and what are just things that, man, it would be great. And I know this isn't at work, but it would be great if they made their bed, but does it really matter in the scheme of life if the person's bed is made or not, especially if they live by themselves and no one's going to be even seeing the bed really, yeah, so identifying what are the important issues and really focusing on those things. And if those are the things that need to be adapted or you really need to adjust and make sure that that's happening, then figuring out what supports can be put into place, what accommodations can be made to help with those different kinds of things. Yeah. And I loved that you had the slide that was really looking at taking what may be considered a negative under ADHD or any kind of
Mhm.
disability into a positive, and how that really um, we talk about that all the time in job coaching, is looking at somebody's what's perceived to be negative, or the labels that they've gotten of laziness or hyperactivity or other kinds of things, but they can really be positives in different situations for people. Maybe someone who's lazy is laid back and going to be more to go with the flow with things, or if they're considered lazy, I should say, or if they have high energy, that can be something that's really positive in different settings depending what they are. And I think people were responding to that too and saying that they loved hearing about the strengths, because so often when we talk about disability, we are just so focused on the negatives.
Yeah.
And I actually had heard somebody talk recently about when her son's an older adult at this point in his 20s, but when he was diagnosed with autism, that they call it the day of nevers, because the doctors and the professionals just listed off all the things he was supposedly never going to be able to do. And obviously, she said he's ticked off at this
Yeah.
point, almost all of those nevers, and they're working on the other ones and fully expect that those are going to be things he's going to be able to do as well. So I love the idea of focusing on strengths and the importance of that. And I think we all need to do that. None of us go to an interview and talk about all the things we can't do. We talk about what we're going to be able to bring to that business and how we're good at what we do. So I think we need to flip the way we think about people with disabilities of all types in that discussion, and really start talking more about strengths. So I really appreciated that you focused on that as well.
So there are so many questions in the chat.
I
If you
know.
if you can email me the chat, I can
Yeah, I'm actually, as we're thinking, I'm thinking, and I'm going to say that I think Anne's on, but I'm going to just say maybe we can partner and come up with some sort of like frequently asked questions document that we could put out as an organization to help with a lot of these questions too.
Yeah,
Because,
and also I put in the chat, like, follow me on Instagram at ADHD at work. So there's a form in like the link tree. You can click on the link and you can submit questions, and I will create a reel about the question to answer the
oh,
question,
awesome.
or I will do a live. I also host IG lives regularly, so then they all live on my YouTube page as well. And so if you go to my website, you can get access to that. But the so my YouTube page has, and so last October I decided randomly in a very ADHD way that I wanted to host a daily IG live around a different topic with ADHD. And so I continued that over into 2025, not daily though, but just a couple times a month. And so I have different specialists that are familiar with ADHD, and we talk about all things ADHD in a random topic. So financial advisors, psychologists, sex therapists, like literally everything. And and so we can answer some questions there, but you can also submit questions to me. You can DM them to me. You can submit them to the forum, and I will go on Instagram and answer them for you.
That's awesome. That I think people will be really interested in that because I know there's also some very specific questions that
Mhm.
maybe won't apply to the broader audience. So that would be a good way to get you. And I see that Ann put, yes, we can absolutely do that
Yeah, definitely.
in terms of maybe doing a document that we can put together as a joint venture.
Yeah.
I also saw people were appreciating the sign language interpreter, so I wanted to just say that they were saying how great you guys are. I know we're supposed to not pretend you're behind the curtain and not look behind the curtain, but thank you for the work you're doing. I appreciate that too. Um, let's see, what else? I'm trying to think. I wrote some other questions down as people were putting them in. Let's see, what was another one that came up? Um, Oh, someone was saying that how do you tactfully approach someone who has ADHD and they know they're not getting any kind of support or assistance to really kind of recommend that for them?
So, I mean, how familiar are you
Just,
with this person, right? And so that would be the first. That would be the first question I have. I don't necessarily think you should walk up to strangers and then tell them like, "Hey, I think you have ADHD, and you probably should do something about it," right? And so we want to be sensitive to that. And so a lot of it is just dependent on what is your relationship that you have with that person. Are you close enough to be able to point things out? Like, do you have that relationship? Like, I have some friends that I can just tell them like, girl, you have ADHD. Let's talk about it. And then there's other people that I know, and I'm like, "Ugh, they're definitely struggling with ADHD, and I can provide them some resources, or if it happens to come up in conversation, or if I have ADHD myself, and sometimes it's easier for me if I talk about myself and then create an environment that is safe enough for people to disclose to me, then I can be like, oh, okay. I was like, that's great. Like, these are the resources that I use. Maybe this could potentially be helpful for you, helpful for you as well. Like, if you want me to send you some resources, I can, right? And so um, but a lot of it just depends on the relationship that you have with that person.
right. Well, and I think when it applies to work, I would take out any of that disability related stuff anyway and just talk about how they're performing their job. And if you
Mhm.
feel like they're dropping the ball in some of those areas, let's have a conversation about what's going on that's that would help you to be able to do those tasks that you need to do. Or let's have an open and honest conversation about what you might be struggling with. And then maybe the conversation leads to oh,
Right,
I have ADHD and I just found out I had ADHD and I don't even know what to do. And you can then
right,
help provide that person with supports rather than sort of coming in as like, hey, you have ADHD, you need help, kind of
right.
like,
And we have to remember that ADA still has, it's a civil rights law, right? So it's all about protecting people from discrimination. And so thinking also like what's also covered under ADA is recognizing like even if the organization you manage or somebody believes that you have a disability and then discriminates you according to that belief system, that's also a problem, right? And
yeah,
so even if you haven't disclosed, but they're mistreating you because they assume that you have a disability and they're now discriminating against you because of that, like that's still, you're still protected underneath the law in that way.
absolutely. And then another question that came up a lot was where to go to if you think you might have ADHD. I think this happens often when we hear people talk about ADHD, then all of a sudden we all think we also have ADHD. Um, but where do you go to get that diagnosis or to figure out if you do indeed experience that?
So you should talk to your therapist, the psychiatrist in particular, because the psychiatrist will be able, if you are seeking medication or want to treat your ADHD, because we didn't talk about meds at all in this
Okay.
particular conversation. But that's who's going to be able to support you in that way, and some nurse practitioners, I think, can as well. And so I mean, I went to a psychologist and psychotherapist, and was like, listen, I think I have ADHD. And and a lot of it, depending on where you are in the world, their process can look a little bit differently. And then depending even in the United States, the process can look differently as well. There's a lack of providers that are knowledgeable enough about ADHD to be able to diagnose, um, and that don't already have their own preconceived misconceptions of it as well. And so it can be really, in some places in different parts of the country, it can actually be really difficult to get diagnosed. And I don't want to sugarcoat that at all, because, and especially now, there's just a lot of miscommunication that is happening around neurodiversity in general. Like typically with, like, right now, it's, autism is a hot topic, but with ADHD as well, and accessing ADHD medication is also can be really complicated, and so it can be a difficult road in some places, but then it can also be really easy. Right. And so and it's like the same thing when disclosing and trying to get access to accommodations at work. Like in some work environments, it's easy breezy. Like you just walk in, get the services, and then you go about your day and live your life, right? And that's how it should be for everything, but it's not. Like we live in a real world, and so in some contexts it can be really difficult. And so accessing, but with that being said, if you believe that you have ADHD and you want to access ADHD coaching, you can still do that. You do not need a diagnosis to be able to access ADHD coaching. And so if and you do need a diagnosis if you're going to be accessing medication for sure. And in some contexts, you may need a diagnosis to be able to access accommodations within the workplace. But to access executive functioning support, no, you don't need a diagnosis for that. And so if you believe that you have ADHD, then we can talk about that, because well, within my particular practice, we're going to be talking about how your brain works. And what are your weaker executive functions? Like, are you experiencing time blindness? Is flexibility a challenge or a strength of yours? Is planning an organization? Where are you, especially with women? Are you premenopause? Are you menopause? Are you postmenopause? Because what ADHD looks like in those different phases of your life is also going to impact you differently as well. Are you pregnant, postpartum? Like, depending on where you're at, my ADHD was crazy when I was postpartum. And I had to definitely implement a million more strategies than I have to implement right now because of where my
Right.
hormones were.
Well, and what a great point. I think people sometimes think that the way we react or how we are in certain situations is the same no matter what. And yeah, circumstances in someone's life can exacerbate certain disabilities or how they apply in certain situations or minimize them, depending on what the situation is and what's going on with everything else with your body at that particular moment. So I think that's a great point too. And someone had asked about resources. I know mentioned the Job Accommodation Network earlier, which is one of my favorite websites of all time, because even if it spears ideas of things that can
Right.
help in terms of accommodations for the employer as well as the individual, because anybody can go to that website and, like you
Right.
said, type in ADHD and you're going to get a whole list of ideas of things that can be applied on the website. You can also contact us at the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center. We provide technical assistance in that area. So if you are experiencing a specific issue and want to give us a call, we can brainstorm some ideas for that as well. And I don't know, Megan, do you have any final comments before I go to our closing slides with some other information?
I wanted to just co-sign the idea of going and visiting the Mid-Atlantic ADA centers. And if you're not in this particular area, then like any of the ADA centers, like they are awesome. I call them all the time. It's to get some additional supports and just being clarifying like what are my rights and what are my rights are. And also with the chaos and what's happening when like ADA is being under attack and 504 and all the other different policies that help support adults with disabilities in the workplace, being able to go to an organization that is on top of all of that is so incredibly helpful. And everybody is nice. They pick up the phone, they call you back. And I mean, I can't say enough about.
Yes. And I know there's been some restructuring with federal agencies. The ADA centers are still here. We are still working and really available to provide assistance as needed. So thank you for co-signing that, Megan. And thank you
Yeah.
so much for joining us today and provide us with such great information. The comments are blowing up with how great you were and how much they really enjoyed hearing from you and your perspective on all of this. So I thank you. And I'm sure we're going to do part 2s and 3s and 4s as time goes on, if you're interested, because that was really a great experience. So I'm going to move on and do a finish up slides. But again, thank you, Megan, for joining us today. I really do appreciate it. And then we have some information about really exciting events and webinars that are coming up. If you enjoyed this one, I hope you'll join us in July for Breaking Accessibility Barriers in Golf, spotlight on the 2025 U.S. Adaptive Open, which is really cool and happening in the area of where our main office is. We also have on the 30th, identifying partners and creating opportunities, enhancing access to recreation. You can visit the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center website for more information about that or to figure out what our number is and give us a call if you need any technical assistance. In July, Transcend. So Transcend is sort of the parent company Mid-Atlantic ADA Center is part of. Transcend. We're going to be doing a whole session, a whole series on practicing what we preach, building high-performing staff for employment service providers. So if you're an service provider or you know employment service providers, oh, they're starting to flip on their own. Please make sure you join us for that. The links there to registration are available. We're doing it the 16th, the 24th, and the 31st, and there's various phases of hiring people and supporting people and training them throughout. You know, it was interesting, Megan mentioned the onboarding process and how none of us seem to really get a good onboarding process often at businesses, and this is really talking about that and how we can do a better job with that. And then our September series is going to be on ethics. So if you know any VR counselors in particular and need their credits, make sure you're passing this information along to them about that. We will have registration forthcoming about that. So make sure you hit us up for that. We would love for you to join the Transcend email list. I know many of you are part of the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center mailing list, but if you want information specific to the training and events that Transcend is doing, please go to this QR code, or you can go to our website and sign up for our email list. And then finally, we have a transition conference that we just ran in June, and we're doing it again in August so that we can meet across the nation, the different time zones. So on August 13th from 12 to 7, we would love to see you at our transition conference. It's really talking about the different phases of transition and how we can help people make sure that they're leaving the school system with work at the end of that tunnel. And then these are other services that Transcend can offer. So we'd be happy to work with you on a variety of things in that too. So again, thank you, Megan, so much for joining us today. Thanks to everybody for joining us and for the great questions and input. And we'll see you hopefully in June for those sessions as well. Thanks, everyone.